The 12 Dancing Princesses is one of my favorite fairy tales, and that's partly because it's one of the first fairy tales I was exposed to. Way back in kindergarten, my mom ordered a book and tape set from Troll Associates, which I don't think even exists anymore. And that's actually the version that I read to you, this book right here. So reading this was a step back into childhood for me. I'm going to talk about what it is about the 12 Dancing Princesses that I think sort of sets it apart from a lot of better known stories. But first, very briefly, let's talk about some of the motifs that show up. First, we'll talk about numbers, because there are 3 of the 4 that show up in this. 12, most obviously, it's in the title, the 12 princesses, plus the 12 princes and their boats. We also have the number 3. There are 3 nights that the candidates are given to solve the mystery. And then you also have the 3 branches, the silver, gold, and diamonds, that appear in the vineyard that the soldier breaks off as evidence. Now the number 4, if you'll remember from my video about motifs, doesn't show up as frequently or as obviously, but sometimes it's there when you're looking for it, and this is that case. There are 4 objects total that he uses as evidence when he presents his case to the king. The 3 branches plus the goblet, if you'll remember. Additionally, in motifs, we have the magical helper. We have the old woman who shows up and somehow knows exactly what advice to give him, and somehow has her hands on an invisibility cloak that ends up being why he's able to solve the mystery. Most famous magical helper, the fairy godmother in Cinderella. We also have reversal of fortune, which happens in almost every fairy tale, and that is, of course, you have someone from one class moving to a different class. And it can be, it happens in some fairy tales, it can be upwardly mobile and downwardly mobile. Sometimes there's a reverse. Here, of course, we have the working class soldier who ends up becoming a king. Now, the things that set this apart. For starters, we have a male protagonist, which of course we're not as used to in fairy tales. We're used to the whole Disney princess mindset of our protagonist is going to be a female and a princess or someone from the upper class. And that brings me to the other aspect of our male protagonist here, that he is working class, right? Snow White's a princess, The Little Mermaid is a princess, Sleeping Beauty is a princess, Cinderella, while not a princess at the beginning of the story, is upper class at the beginning of the story. And so it's a little refreshing to have a protagonist who is working class, who then is able to move up to become king. The other thing that I really like about this story that I think is a little bit different is I feel that the 12 Dancing Princesses is more magical than many of the fairy tales that we're used to. Now, obviously, there are elements of magic in all fairy tales. The fairy godmother in Cinderella is magic. She creates or gets this dress sort of out of nothing. But a lot of times in those stories, I feel like the magic is very sporadic. It's just kind of a one and done thing. Poof, you have a dress. Okay, but the dress itself isn't magical. It's just that she didn't have a dress and now suddenly she does. The rest of the story is very much based in reality in terms of what is actually possible. However, in this story, we not only have an element of clothing that is in and of itself magical because it makes the wearer invisible, but to me, the presence of that whole other kingdom underground is what makes the story very enchanting to me. You have the trees of silver and gold and diamonds, which of course is a type of magic or enchantment. And then you have the lake and the castle and all of these princes and this whole kingdom that exists underground without anybody knowing about it except for the princesses. And that leads to a lot of questions, a lot of mystery. And for me, that makes the story have a much more magical feel to it throughout. Now, related to that, another thing that I appreciate about this story is that it is filled with mysteries. There are a lot of questions that you can ask that are not answered, and that gives room for the reader to use their imagination to try to fill in those gaps. So the first one is, who is this old woman? She shows up. We don't know who she is or why she helps the soldier. Now, usually in fairy tales, when the protagonist runs into an old woman or an old man on the road, what happens is the old woman or man asks them for help, usually like for food or something. And the protagonist is compassionate and kind to them, and that is then rewarded with that advice or that magical item or whatever it is. This story doesn't give that specification. So if you're someone who has read a lot of fairy tales, you might fill in the gap that way and say, oh, well, probably like he was really nice to her, and so she is doing him a kindness in return. But you could also fill in that gap in a couple of other ways. Maybe she is someone who like somehow recognizes in him a certain quality that she thinks, if he becomes king, right, if he succeeds in this task and becomes king, he will be a wise and just ruler. Or maybe she is a type of fairy godmother or guardian angel. We don't know, but we can use our imaginations to try to fill in that gap. Additionally, there's all these questions about that other kingdom. Where did it come from? How did it exist all of this time without anybody knowing about it other than the princesses? And on that note, how did the princesses find out about it? And what happens to those princes at the end of the story? There are some versions of this story where the princes end up being punished in some way for their role. They're put under a spell or they're executed or something. But very rarely do you come across those versions. Most versions just end with the soldier marrying the oldest and becoming king. And that's it. There's no mention of the princes again. So that's another big thing of being able to fill in those gaps for yourself. Now, there is something about this story that always used to bother me, and that is that the soldier chooses the oldest. When I first heard the story as a kindergartner, and then for most of my life, I was really upset that he didn't choose the youngest princess, because she's the one who suspects him. She's the one who is wary enough or clever enough to realize that something is going on. And I always felt like she should be rewarded, right, with the marriage and the kingdom, really. But more recently, as I think about it, I can appreciate the ending for two reasons. One is that the soldier himself says, I'm not as young as I used to be, right? He acknowledges that if he were to choose the youngest princess, it would be inappropriate, right? There would be a large age gap that would not lend itself to a successful or happy marriage. And so I can appreciate that. But more so, kind of along the vein of filling in some gaps, is I've been thinking about it. And I like to think that the oldest princess knew, or at least suspected, that the soldier was onto them. And she silenced the youngest so that the soldier could succeed in his quest. So I think if I were going to write a version of this that was longer and filled in a lot of those gaps, I would have the oldest princess and the soldier sort of hitting it off at dinner or something, and her realizing that she would like him to succeed and to marry her. So she silences the youngest so that he can go ahead and follow them and find out what happens. But again, that's just me and my imagination, and certainly that is open to interpretation to anyone who is reading the story, and that's one of the things that I really appreciate it. And I hope that it's something that you appreciated about it as well. Now, this story is not as old as some of the fairy tales that I've been reading. It's certainly not nearly as old as things like Cinderella or Snow White. In fact, when historians are trying to trace it back, I think it only goes as far back as like the 17th century. and there aren't as many variants as there are for stories like Cinderella. And so that might be part of why it seems more magical, because it's a little bit more modern and maybe has a bit more of a romantic feel to it because it is relatively new. However, it's obviously still firmly a fairy tale and comes from oral tradition. And there are different variants of it, just not as wide of a variety as things like Cinderella. So I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that my talk of all of the unanswered questions gets you maybe thinking about it and thinking about how you would fill in those gaps for yourself. Until next time, I wish you a very happily ever after.